In the first days after D-Day, behind the exits of Omaha Beach, a line of German prisoners was marched away from the water. They'd come out of the bluffs stunned, hungry, and half-deaf from naval gunfire. Some were wounded, some were boys. Most of them had not slept, but the thing that made several of them stop walking was not the ruined beach. It was the traffic. GMC trucks rolled off landing craft in steady files, tires chewing through the sand. Jeeps bounced around shell holes with radio antennas whipping in the sea wind. Fuel tankers crawled uphill toward the bluffs. Ambulances reversed toward aid stations. Bulldozers cut new roads into France while soldiers shouted over idling engines. And behind them, out in the channel, more ships waited with more vehicles. A German private looked at it all, then turned to the American guard beside him and asked, in broken English, the one question that exposed the entire war, "Where are the horses?" The guard did not answer, not because he was keeping a secret, because the question made no sense to him. He had never served in an army that needed horses to move its guns. He had never watched ammunition wagons sink in mud behind a team of exhausted animals. He had never seen a field kitchen arrive behind a limping draft horse. To that American, an army came on wheels. To the German prisoner, that was almost impossible to understand, because the army he belonged to, the army the world had been taught to fear as the most modern war machine on earth, was still carried by hooves. The Wehrmacht entered the Second World War with more than 500,000 horses. Before the war ended, it would use roughly 2.75 million of them. At any given moment, about 1.1 million horses served somewhere inside the German military machine. 3 out of every 4 German divisions depended on horses as their main transport, not as decoration, not as cavalry romance, as logistics. Horses pulled artillery, horses pulled ammunition, horses pulled kitchens, medical carts, bakery wagons, bridging equipment, and supply columns. The German army could break a front with tanks, but most of the army behind those tanks still moved at the speed of a walking animal. The army that captured that prisoner was different in a way he could see before anyone explained it. The United States would buy nearly 2.4 million military trucks during the war. It would build more than 630,000 jeeps. It would send divisions across oceans with enough engines, fuel cans, tires, mechanics, and spare parts to make movement itself into a weapon. Not one American infantry division in Europe relied on horses to move its normal transport. Not one. That was the difference hidden under the whole war. Not courage. Both sides had courage, not intelligence. Both sides had brilliant officers, not even tanks, aircraft, or artillery by themselves. The decisive difference was this: one army had built a doctrine of speed on top of animals. The other army had built a civilization around engines. And when those two worlds collided in Europe, the world with engines did not just move faster. It rewrote what war could be. The machine that mattered most in Europe was not glamorous. It was not the Sherman tank. It was not the Mustang fighter. It was not a battleship. It was not the atomic bomb. It was a 2.5-ton cargo truck. Dwight Eisenhower later named the pieces of equipment that Allied commanders considered essential to victory in Africa and Europe. He listed the bulldozer, the jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport aircraft. None of them was designed to kill. That is what makes the list so revealing. The war in Europe was not won only by the machines of destruction. It was won by the machines of arrival. The truck at the center of that story was the GMC CCKW, the Deuce and a Half, known to soldiers simply as the Jimmy. It could haul 2.5 tons on paper, and much more when nobody was asking questions. It could pull through mud. It could climb bad roads. It could carry fuel one day, ammunition the next, rations the next, and wounded men when there was no ambulance close enough. GMC built more than 528,000 of them during the war, with the wider family, including the amphibious DUKW, reaching roughly 572,000 vehicles. They came out of Pontiac, Michigan, and St. Louis, Missouri. They became cargo trucks, dump trucks, fuel trucks, water trucks, fire trucks, mobile workshops, surgical vans, and anything else an army needed when the front kept moving. Then there was the Jeep, a quarter-ton vehicle born from a desperate army requirement in 1940, prototyped at impossible speed, fought over by Bantam, Willys, and Ford, and then produced in enormous numbers. Willys and Ford built more than 637,000 Jeeps. The Jeep did the small jobs that horses had done for centuries. It carried officers, it pulled light loads, it ran messages, it moved scouts. It evacuated wounded men from places a larger truck could not reach. It was not just a vehicle. It was the mechanical replacement for the horse. But the real American advantage was not any single truck. The real advantage was that the trucks were normal. America already knew how to live with engines. By the time the United States entered the war, the largest automobile industry in history was sitting behind the Army like a loaded spring. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Studebaker, Mack, Dodge, Chevrolet, and dozens of suppliers could turn civilian assembly line to military production lines faster than German planners believed possible. William Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who had run Chevrolet and then General Motors, was brought into uniform and commissioned directly as a lieutenant general in 1942. His job was blunt. Turn Detroit into an arsenal. He did. American industry produced about 2.4 million military trucks across all classes, more than 600,000 Jeeps, about 86,000 tanks, more than 300,000 military aircraft, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. The numbers are so large they almost stop meaning anything, so put them beside Germany. During the war, German army truck intake was roughly 250,000 vehicles. America built more military trucks than that in a single year. And it was not only quantity, it was sameness. A mechanic trained on a GMC in Louisiana could fix a GMC in Normandy. A spare part pulled from a damaged truck in Italy could keep another truck moving in France. A driver did not have to relearn the vehicle every time he changed units. Standardization turned abundance into speed. Germany had the opposite problem. The Wehrmacht operated a chaotic fleet of German vehicles, French vehicles, Czech vehicles, Italian vehicles, captured Soviet vehicles, and civilian models dragged into military service because there was no other choice. A replacement part for an Opel Blitz did not fit a French Renault truck. A French axle did not fit a Czech Tatra. A Soviet-captured truck might run perfectly until one part broke, and then become a dead object no German depot could easily revive. The Americans solved the logistics of logistics. The Germans multiplied their problems every time they added another vehicle type, and because they could not build enough trucks, they returned again and again to the animal that required no gasoline: the horse. A standard German infantry division in 1939 needed between 4,000 and 6,000 horses to function. Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, estimated that an infantry division required about 4,500 horses and 2,000 horse-drawn vehicles just to move its equipment and supplies. Those horses had to eat, not symbolically, not occasionally, every day. A horse under work could require 12 to 20 pounds of feed daily. In weight, that could be about 10 times what a human soldier consumed. A division's horses could eat more than 50 tons of fodder per day, and the fodder had to be moved forward by the same railways, roads, wagons, and supply columns already struggling to carry ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and replacement parts. The horse seemed to save gasoline, but it created another fuel system: oats, hay, veterinary hospitals, shoes, harness, rest cycles, grazing limits, disease, exhaustion. A truck that broke down could be repaired, towed, cannibalized, or bypassed. A horse that collapsed under load could stop the team, the wagon, and sometimes the whole column behind it. A heavy draft animal worked hard for days, then deteriorated. It did not reset like a machine after a part swap. Horses needed recovery measured in weeks or months. They died in staggering numbers. The exact total is uncertain, but estimates run from hundreds of thousands to more than 1.5 million German military horses lost in service. The Wehrmacht built a vast veterinary system because it had to. Every infantry division, mountain division, and cavalry brigade entered the war with veterinary support. Horse hospitals, designed for about 500 animals, were overwhelmed on the Eastern Front, sometimes taking in thousands. This was not a side note. It was the hidden skeleton of the German army. The newsreels showed the panzers. The propaganda showed Stukas screaming down from the sky. The world remembered the clean steel point of Blitzkrieg, but behind the point was a column of men and animals moving like it was still 1870. That contradiction did not appear all at once. At first it looked like genius. In Poland and France, German armored spearheads broke open enemy lines with terrifying speed. Tanks, radios, aircraft, and doctrine combined into something the world had not seen before. But Blitzkrieg was a spearhead. It was not the whole spear. For every armored division racing forward, there were many infantry divisions walking behind it. Their guns rolled on horse-drawn limbers. Their field kitchens creaked along on wagons. Their supply train moved at the pace of hooves. Of the German divisions active late in 1944, only a minority were armored or mechanized. The rest moved in a way Napoleon would have understood. This is why the question on Omaha Beach mattered. Where are your horses? It was not a foolish question from an ignorant man. It was a professional question from a soldier whose army could not imagine movement without animals, and the answer was standing around him in the sand. The Americans had replaced the horse not just with a vehicle, but with a system. Factories made trucks, refineries made fuel, schools, farms, garages, and machine shops produced drivers and mechanics before the army ever drafted them. Road culture trained millions of ordinary men in the habits of engines. To understand that, you have to leave Normandy and go back 3 decades, not to a battlefield, to a factory floor in Michigan. In 1913, Henry Ford's Highland Park plant introduced the moving assembly line to automobile production. That one decision changed more than the price of a car. It changed what ordinary Americans knew how to do. In 1908, a Model T cost $850, a fortune for a working man. By 1924, the price had fallen to around $260. A machine that had belonged to the wealthy became something a farmer, shopkeeper, mechanic, or factory worker could buy. By the middle of the 1920s, the United States had roughly 1 automobile for every 6 people. Britain had about 1 for every 44. Germany had about 1 for every 196. That difference did not just create traffic, it created competence. An American farm boy in the 1930s might grow up driving a tractor before he was old enough to vote. He might know how to patch a tire, clean a carburetor, listen to an engine knock, and get a truck started in bad weather because the nearest help was miles away. When that young man entered the army and was handed a 2.5-ton truck, the vehicle was bigger, heavier, and painted olive drab. But it was not alien. It belonged to a world he already understood. The average German conscript had no matching civilian background. Germany was a rail-centered, coal-powered economy where private automobile ownership was rare by American standards. Many soldiers had never driven a car before the army tried to teach them a truck. Germany had excellent engineers. It did not have millions of mechanically fluent citizens at the same scale. That difference mattered every time a convoy had to keep moving in the rain, at night, under fire, with no officer nearby, and no perfect spare part in sight. Germany saw part of the problem before the war even began. In 1939, Colonel Adolf von Schell proposed a program to rationalize the Wehrmacht's vehicle chaos. The army was operating more than 100 types of trucks and dozens of passenger cars. The Shell program tried to reduce the mess to a smaller number of standardized models. It was the right idea. It was also too late. You cannot decree a Detroit into existence. Germany lacked the industrial capacity, raw materials, rubber, fuel, and time to build what the army actually needed. After conquering France, the Wehrmacht pressed captured civilian trucks into military use just to keep expanding. The result was a patchwork military fleet wearing German paint. Every captured truck solved today's shortage and created tomorrow's maintenance crisis. The United States had the opposite inheritance. Its civilian world had already rehearsed motorized war. It had filling stations, machine shops, highways, garage, truck routes, oil fields, factories that understood scale, workers who understood assembly, drivers who understood engines. The American Army did not invent that culture, it mobilized it, and at first it did not use it well. February 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The first major collision between American ground forces and the German army was humiliating. Green American units, poorly coordinated and badly led, met Rommel's veterans and were hammered. Thousands of casualties in a handful of days. Tanks knocked out or abandoned. Supply dumps misplaced. Ammunition sitting in depots while frontline units ran short. The Germans looked at the American wreckage and thought their assumptions had been confirmed. The Americans had factories, not soldiers, money, not discipline, machines, not war spirit. They called the U.S. Army the Dollar Army. It was meant as an insult. But Kasserine was not the verdict, it was the lesson. The same army that stumbled in Tunisia spent the next 18 months learning how to make mechanized abundance behave like a battlefield weapon. In North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, Americans learned hard procedures that do not look heroic on a monument: how to stage depots, how to rotate truck companies, how to track fuel consumption across hundreds of miles, how to keep spare parts moving, how to run maintenance before trucks failed, how to deliver ammunition to the unit that needed it before the commander screamed for it. The men did not suddenly become different. The machine learned to use its machines. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in France, the U.S. Army had become something new in military history, a mass army whose default condition was motorized movement. For weeks after D-Day, the system grew behind the beaches. Engineers opened exits through the bluffs. Trucks ran from dumps to units and back again. Fuel cans stacked in fields. Mechanics worked in mud. Roads that had been farm lanes became military arteries. Then, after the breakout from Normandy, the Allied armies did something dangerous. They moved too fast for their own supply line. By late August 1944, Paris was liberated and the German army in France was falling back. The front had leapt hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches, but the rail network had been smashed by Allied bombing before D-Day to slow German reinforcements. Major ports were either unusable, still contested, or too far from the front. Every gallon of gasoline, every shell, every ration, every bandage, and every replacement tire had to come by road. The armies were not stopped by German resistance first. They were stopped by distance. Patton's Third Army alone could burn hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline in a day. Individual divisions consumed hundreds of tons of supplies daily. The arithmetic was merciless. If fuel did not arrive, tanks became statues. If ammunition did not arrive, artillery became scenery. If food did not arrive, soldiers became weak. If tires and parts did not arrive, the trucks carrying all of it began to die on the road. So the Americans built an answer in a hurry. They called it the Red Ball Express. It began on August 25, 1944. 2 one-way routes were carved across France for military truck traffic. Loaded trucks went forward on one road. Empty trucks returned on another. Military police controlled intersections. Civilian traffic was cleared. Convoys ran day and night. At its peak, nearly 6,000 vehicles were on the road. On August 29, its busiest day, more than 12,000 tons of supplies were delivered forward. Over 83 days, the Red Ball Express moved more than 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment, and the men behind the wheel made the story sharper. Approximately 3/4 of the Red Ball drivers were African American soldiers. In a segregated army, black soldiers were often denied combat roles and pushed into service units. Yet during the desperate race across France, those service units kept the combat army alive. They drove 20-hour shifts. They drove under blackout rules, often with little or no light. They drove through bomb craters, rain, fog, fatigue, and the constant pressure of commanders who needed fuel yesterday. They overloaded trucks. They bent regulations. They fixed axles on the shoulder. They slept when the truck stopped and woke when it moved. One driver later remembered the rule as simple: when Patton wanted you there, you got there. That was not a slogan. It was logistics under exhaustion. The Red Ball Express did not make good movie imagery in the old heroic style. It was mud, grease, sleep deprivation, and gasoline. But without it, the Allied advance across France would have stalled. The trucks kept running, and because they kept running, the front kept moving. The Germans saw the result, but often misread the cause. To them, Allied success looked like unfair abundance. Too many trucks, too much fuel, too many aircraft, too much ammunition. And they were not wrong about the abundance. They were wrong to treat abundance as something separate from military power. A truck was not just a truck. A tire was not just rubber. A fuel can was not just a container. Together they were tempo. They let an army arrive before the enemy had finished reacting. They let a commander shift divisions faster than a horse-drawn army could shift artillery. They let repairs, replacements, rations, and ammunition keep up with victory. A tank breakthrough without trucks is a temporary hole in a line. A tank breakthrough with trucks becomes pursuit. That was the lesson Germany never solved at scale. Nowhere was that failure more brutal than in the East. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Germany attacked the Soviet Union with around 3.5 million men, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and more than 600,000 horses. The map was vast. The objectives were distant. The front stretched over 1,000 miles, and the army advancing into that space was mostly not motorized. Armored and motorized spearheads raced forward. Behind them came infantry divisions on foot, artillery pulled by horses, and supply wagons that depended on fodder as much as the tanks depended on fuel. At first, the pace looked unstoppable. Then distance began taking revenge. Soviet railways used a wider gauge than German and Western European railways, so captured track had to be converted before German trains could use it. Until then, supplies had to move by road. But much of the road network in Western Russia was not a road network in the Western European sense. It was dirt, and when the autumn rains came, the dirt became a season. Rasputitsa, the time without roads. Wagons sank to their axles, trucks disappeared into mud, horses strained until they collapsed, panzer spearheads outran fuel, infantry outran bread, artillery outran ammunition. By October 1941, German Army Group Center was losing horses at a catastrophic rate, and the advance toward Moscow was no longer only a military contest. It was a supply system tearing itself apart. The Germans tried to adapt. They requisitioned Soviet horses, especially hardy local animals, often called Panjay horses. They were better suited to the climate and terrain, but they were too small for some German loads. German wagons were heavy. German artillery was heavy. The adaptation itself required new wagons, captured carts, lighter loads, and more improvisation. Every solution arrived with another complication. Then came Stalingrad. When the Sixth Army drove toward the Volga in 1942, it brought tens of thousands of horses into the campaign. As the battle stretched, more animals accumulated in the rear areas between the Don and the Volga. But a horse army cannot live inside an urban siege. There was no grazing. Fodder had to be carried. Every pound of feed competed with ammunition and human food. German commanders moved many horses to the rear to reduce the burden. Then the Soviet encirclement closed. On November 23, 1942, the Sixth Army was trapped, and a terrible irony unfolded. The army could not break out properly because much of the transport needed to move its guns, and supplies was outside the pocket. The horses still inside became meat. As rations collapsed, soldiers slaughtered the animals that had carried the army there. Letters from the pocket remembered the smell, fire, sweat, and dead horses. The army the world had called mechanized was starving in a frozen pocket because it still depended on animals it could not feed. Stalingrad exposed what had always been true. Blitzkrieg had been a bright mechanical skin over a body that still belonged to an older century. The same truth returned in Normandy. By June and July 1944, the Allies owned the sky over northern France. American P-47s and British Typhoons hunted road traffic relentlessly. German units moving toward the invasion front had to move by night, hide by day, and pray that dust, moonlight, or careless movement did not reveal them. What Allied pilots found on many roads was not the clean modern juggernaut of German propaganda. It was horse columns, artillery teams, wagons, field kitchens, supply carts. Exhausted animals being pushed through bocage lanes under air attack. A panzer division might have tanks at the front of its order of battle, but its supply elements still depended on slower, more vulnerable transport. Infantry divisions arriving at the front sometimes lost so many horses en route that they could not move their own guns properly once they got there. The Americans could move in daylight under their own air umbrella. The Germans moved at night with animals. That difference compounded every day. An hour became a delay. A delay became a missed counterattack. A missed counterattack became a collapsed line. A collapsed line became a retreat that the trucks could chase and the horses could not escape. By August 1944, German mobility was no longer merely inferior. It was fatal, and the engine did not only beat Germany in the West. It helped beat Germany in the East. Under Lend-Lease, the United States shipped more than 400,000 trucks and vehicles to the Soviet Union. Soviet industry, evacuated and rebuilt under extraordinary pressure, produced fewer trucks than it needed. American trucks filled the gap. The most loved was the Studebaker US-6, a rugged 2.5-ton truck built largely for export. Studebaker produced around 197,000 US-6 trucks, and more than 150,000 went to the Soviet Union. Soviet soldiers called it the Stud. It hauled supplies, it moved infantry, it carried artillery ammunition, it became the favored chassis for Katyusha rocket launchers. The Red Army that rolled from Stalingrad to Berlin did not do so only on Soviet steel. A large part of it rode on American wheels. Nikita Khrushchev later said openly that without those American vehicles, it was difficult to imagine how the Red Army could have advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin at the pace it did. That statement should not be read as diminishing Soviet sacrifice. It clarifies the same hidden law of modern war. The army that cannot move cannot exploit victory. The Soviet Union supplied blood, depth, endurance, and enormous combat power. American trucks supplied mobility. Together they created a pressure Germany could not match. Even if Germany had wanted to close the gap, another problem blocked the road: fuel. Germany had almost no domestic petroleum. It depended heavily on Romanian oil from Ploesti and on synthetic fuel made from coal through expensive industrial processes. Synthetic fuel was technically impressive. It was strategically fragile. At its peak in early 1944, German synthetic plants supplied a vast share of aviation gasoline and a major share of total petroleum needs. But beginning in May 1944, Allied bombers made fuel production a primary target. The results were devastating. Synthetic output collapsed. Ploesti fell to the Soviets in August. By late 1944 and early 1945, Germany's fuel crisis was no longer a shortage, it was strangulation. This is where the horse becomes more understandable and more tragic. Horses were slow, horses were fragile, horses ate constantly, but horses did not need gasoline. For a state without enough oil, the horse was not nostalgia, it was a desperate workaround. That workaround set a ceiling on everything Germany tried to do. A horse could not let an army pivot 100 miles in 48 hours. A horse could not make a collapsing front elastic. A horse could not keep tanks supplied across a continent. A horse could not outrun air power. A horse could not turn a breakthrough into sustained pursuit. The horse kept the German army alive and kept it slow. German commanders understood pieces of this. Rommel understood it in North Africa, where every mile of desert punished bad supply. He wrote that brave men meant little without guns. Guns meant little without ammunition, and neither ammunition nor guns mattered in mobile warfare without vehicles and petrol to move them. That is one of the clearest statements any general made about the war. Rommel's genius could win tactical victories, it could not fill fuel tanks. At the strategic level, Albert Speer later recorded how deeply Hitler underestimated the United States. Hitler believed America lacked unity, sacrifice, and military seriousness. He saw immigrants, consumers, and factories, but did not understand the power of a society organized around production and movement. That contempt was not a personality flaw at the edge of policy. It was a strategic assumption, and it was wrong. The German officer corps saw the mistake more clearly after capture. At Trent Park, the British held senior German officers in a comfortable estate outside London. The prisoners talked freely, not knowing the rooms were wired. British intelligence listened. Again and again the officers returned to Allied material superiority. The trucks, the fuel, the ammunition, the replacements, the endless equipment. Some sounded impressed, some sounded resentful, some sounded personally offended, as if war had become unfair because the enemy could put more machines into motion. But that reaction missed the point. Material superiority was not outside warfare. It was warfare, especially once warfare became movement across continents. A rifle without ammunition is a stick. A tank without fuel is a bunker. A brilliant plan without trucks is paper. All of this reached its final, desperate proof in December 1944, the Ardennes. Hitler's last great offensive in the West. 3 German armies attacked through the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, aiming for Antwerp. If they could split the Allied armies, capture the port, and shock the Western Allies, Hitler imagined he might force a political result. That was the theory. The reality was decided before the first assault troops moved. By fuel. The German offensive began with roughly days of fuel, not weeks. The plan depended on seizing American fuel dumps during the advance. Think about that. Germany launched its last major offensive in the West on the assumption that the enemy would provide the gasoline required to finish it. At first, German spearheads captured some fuel. Kampfgruppe Pieper, the armored column under Joachim Peiper, seized a depot at Bullingen with tens of thousands of gallons. But the numbers did not close. Heavy German tanks drank fuel at an obscene rate. Traffic jammed on narrow forest roads. Bridges failed. American resistance stiffened. Engineers blew fuel depots before they could be taken. At Francorchamps, American troops destroyed a huge gasoline dump rather than let it fall into German hands. Red Ball drivers and supply troops rushed fuel away from threatened areas through snow and darkness. The Germans advanced into the one thing they could not manufacture, an empty tank. Pieper's column finally ran dry near Le Gleize. The King Tigers and other armored vehicles that had terrified Allied soldiers became silent masses of steel in the snow. Their crews abandoned them and escaped on foot. Behind them, German roads choked with the same contradiction that had haunted the Wehrmacht since 1939. horses and trucks in the same lanes, wagons blocking vehicles, vehicles without fuel blocking wagons, dead animals, overturned carts, stalled engines, and staff officers trying to make speed out of a system built from incompatibility. Some German movements in the Ardennes slowed to a crawl, not because the Americans were everywhere, but because the German army was in its own way. On the other side, once the shock passed, the American response showed what a fully motorized army could do. The 101st Airborne was trucked to Bastogne in a rush. C-47s dropped supplies when roads were cut. Patton's Third Army pivoted 3 divisions from an eastward drive to a northward attack and moved toward Bastogne with a speed the Germans could not match. That maneuver is often remembered as an act of command brilliance. It was also an act of logistics. A commander can order a pivot. Only trucks, fuel, drivers, maintenance crews, traffic control, and supply discipline can make that order physical. Patton's lead tanks did not arrive alone. Fuel trucks came behind them. That was the difference. By the end of the Ardennes offensive, Germany had spent irreplaceable men, vehicles, and fuel it did not possess. The Western Front recovered. The Soviet front kept advancing. The Reich had gambled its last mobility and lost it. After the war, German generals wrote memoirs. They blamed Hitler, they blamed Allied air power, they blamed Soviet numbers, they blamed impossible odds. Much of that was true, but those explanations often softened the deeper truth. Germany had gone to war as a partially motorized economy, pretending it could fight a fully motorized global war. It could build magnificent weapons. Tigers, Panthers, jet aircraft, rockets, but modern war is not won by magnificent weapons sitting still. It is won by ordinary things arriving on time. Fuel, ammunition, tires, food, replacement parts, drivers, mechanics, roads, depots, recovery vehicles. More trucks when the first trucks fail. Germany could design a Panther tank. America could build the truck that brought fuel to a tank. The truck that brought shells to the artillery covering that tank. The truck that brought food to the infantry beside it. The truck that carried the wounded away, and the truck that hauled the broken engine part back from the depot. That is not less glamorous than tank warfare. It is the condition that makes tank warfare possible. By 1945, there were German armored vehicles that could not move because no fuel existed for them. Machines that had absorbed thousands of man-hours, tons of steel, and the pride of an engineering culture sat useless. Nearby, horses still pulled what remained of the German supply system. The Third Reich began the war with horses. It ended the war with horses, and in between, it proved one of the hardest truths in military history. Technology without logistics is theater. The American advantage was not merely that it had depth, more trucks, more drivers, more mechanics, more spare parts, more fuel, more roads, more factories, more machine tools, more oil, more people who had grown up in a mechanical civilization before they ever wore a uniform. It was not a gap, it was geology. Germany was trying to dig through a mountain. America was the mountain. That is why the German prisoner's question on the beach matters so much. Where are your horses? He was standing at the edge of a future his own army could not enter. The horses were not missing. They were on his side of the war, pulling guns, eating grain, dying in mud, blocking roads, dragging wagons through the 20th century at 4 miles an hour. The Americans had no horses because they had spent 30 years building something else. A country of engines, a country of roads, a country of garages, tractors, oil fields, assembly lines, and men who could hear a bad motor before they could describe the problem. When that country went to war, it did not just send soldiers. It sent the habits of an entire machine civilization. The Germans called it material superiority. Rommel called it the quartermaster's war. Speer called it a production gap. All of them were describing the same collision. One army tried to fight a war of speed with an animal at its center. The other brought the engine all the way down to the last ration box, the last fuel can, the last wounded man, the last mile. The war was not won by trucks alone. But without the trucks, victory could not move. And an army that cannot move is already waiting to be beaten. In the end, the question was never where the American horses were. The question was how long an army built on horses could survive once the engines arrived. It survived longer than it should have. Then the engines passed it.